The title of today's message is Let No One Separate. It comes from Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. Our key verse is verse 9. Let's go ahead and look at verse 9 together and read it together. Okay, let's go.
Therefore, God has joined together, let no one separate.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for blessing us with Jesus. Thank you so much for his teachings and revelation into what life is really about. Thank you so much for the instructions that he gave us about marriage through this passage. Please help us to really open up our hearts and see the importance of the right way of marriage that glorifies you and builds up others and creates the right environment that you intend. Please guide us through this passage from beginning to the end. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. My wife and I, we have a friend. She's not a believer, but she was telling my wife Sarah that she had a conversation with her significant other that when they first met, she had 100 butterflies in her stomach. You guys know what that means? That butterflies in your stomach. It's a figure of speech that describes the excitement and the anticipation that you have for something or someone. And she told Sarah that in her conversation with her husband that she said, when I first met you, I had 100 butterflies in my stomach, but now I have 3. And she continued, what are you going to do about it? So she went from 100 butterflies in her stomach down to 3. And the problem is that she, in a lot of ways, was and is disillusioned by her spouse, by the man that she thought was the one. And she put the ball in his court. What was he going to do about it? What was he as a man going to do about the disillusionment of his wife? Turns out, if you dig into the relationship a little bit more, the husband, instead of loving God and loving his wife, works hard, makes good money, but at night he escapes through alcohol and through enjoying entertainment on the television and computer. And so this caused a major disillusionment of his wife. In today's passage, we're going to learn all about marriage, but not from the world's point of view, but from God's point of view. So let's begin by part 1, Your Hearts Were Hard, Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. Let's read these verses responsibly. I'll go first. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. What did Moses command you? He replied. It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law, Jesus replied. Here in this first verse, verse 1, we see the expression that he taught them. It says, again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Jesus taught a lot of things. There's a lot of things that are necessary to learn in life, especially necessary to learn from Jesus. And I think there's 2 types. There's things that we need to be taught and learn that things you never learned about. Things that you weren't even aware that Jesus teaches you. Things of the kingdom of heaven and the truths of God that the world has no clue about. But there's another category of things that you must learn about, and things that you learned wrong. The topic of marriage is definitely 100% in which category? 1 or 2? 2, absolutely. Who doesn't know about marriage? We learn about it from television, we learn about it from examples around us, we learn about it from books. So much content is out there to learn about marriage. The problem is is that marriage came from the mind of God, and as such, has to be learned from God, not from these other sources. And because everybody has an opinion about what marriage should and should not be, it can be very confusing, and we can be attracted to the things about marriage that we like. But this is not the right way to go about it. One last thing to consider is that, the things that you've never learned about, relatively speaking, those are hard. But the things you learn wrong it's very hard. Why? Because you have to unlearn all the lies that you've bought into and adopt a foreign, new perspective that maybe is not as good for yourself as the old way. So we must relearn everything about marriage. Many people might think, even in Christianity, that we know about marriage. Even I thought I knew about marriage, but when I studied this passage, oh my gosh, I was like, wow, there was a lot more I needed to learn. So let's sit at the feet of Jesus and learn about what he has to teach us here. Let's look at verse 2. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? What did Moses command you? He replied. They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. And then he continued, it was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law, Jesus replied. Now, it says here that the Pharisees came and tested Jesus, right? If you're giving a test, that means you're the teacher. And that the person you're testing, you want to see if they have the right answer. So they came to Jesus because they knew what they thought was the right answer. And so they wanted to test Jesus to see if he had the right answer. And so Jesus, knowing their game, asked, what did Moses permit you? What did Moses write about? And then they mentioned the certificate of divorce. And Jesus gives an interesting point here. It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. So let's take a look at this law real quick, because maybe you haven't seen it in a while or have never seen this. So it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. I'll read this for us, okay? If a man married, and this is obviously Moses who wrote this. This is Old Testament Deuteronomy. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So what's going on in this passage? This is obviously a time thousands and thousands of years ago where women really had a tough position. Back then, the kind of work was a lot of agriculture work, a lot of back-breaking work, and because of the physicality of men, they were more well-adjusted for that back-breaking work. So women were completely dependent on a man in order to find a sustainable existence in a tough world. Just even to get bread on the table was not, you couldn't go down to Ralph's, obviously, and just buy a loaf of bread for $1.50. Life was tough back then. It was very, very hard. And so women really had to attach themselves to a man in order to have provisions. It was really tough. Even families had to be brought together. Children had to go out to the fields. It was tough for everybody. But the problem is that because of the position of men, they oftentimes they were very harsh towards women. So look at this. I underlined a couple sections here. if the woman becomes displeasing to him. This was the kind of people that Moses was working with. The hearts of the Israelites were hardened. The men were selfish. And so Moses had them write a certificate of divorce so at least the woman could move on from that first man who was so selfish that he would cut her off just for being displeasing to him in some manner that was very highly subjective. And look at verse 3. And if her second husband dislikes her, this was the painful reality for many women. And so this certificate of divorce was at least an effort to mitigate the hardened hearts of selfish men in the times of Moses. In fact, if you think about it, they were so hardened to their authority and their selfish desires to be so harsh towards their wives that the only thing God could do was to put some kind of roadblock of this certificate of divorce. He couldn't even teach them the right way of marriage at this time until today's passage. But Jesus pointed directly towards this issue, that this certificate of divorce was not because it was the right thing to do, but it was the least that God could do with the hardened hearts of the Israelite men. They had enjoyed the authority and the selfishness and had completely abused, nor were they even curious to understand the true meaning of marriage. So we can say that selfishness hardens the heart. Self-seeking desires in the context of marriage and in the context of life even, selfishness hardens the heart to the point where God cannot even teach anymore. It was because your hearts were hardened that Moses wrote you this law, Jesus replied. It was not the right thing to do, and Jesus is going to clarify what the right thing to do is. But let's think about this passage in the context of this section of Mark's gospel. So, Robert mentioned it. I also mentioned it that, just for fun, how many times did Jesus talk about his death and resurrection in Mark's gospel? 3 times, right? 3 times. Mark chapter 8, Mark chapter 9, Mark chapter 10. I think that this is one of the most important pieces to understand a lot of passages. There's a lot of passages in these chapters. We could call this, and many people do call this, the way of the cross. Just a little while ago, we learned about leadership and greatness. The idea was that leadership, if you're the greatest, it's like, everybody needs to do what I want them to do. And whoever's the strongest willed and the tallest and most great person, they're going to be the leader. But Jesus taught that anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. So then we look at this passage, marriage drops in here. Between the second and then the third. That's very embarrassing. Don't feel embarrassed. So marriage is dropped in here. Why is marriage here? It is because marriage is the best institution to learn how to serve. It is the best, amen. It is the best institution to learn how to sacrifice for another person. In fact, if you cannot sacrifice for your wife as a husband, how can you sacrifice for the body of Christ and the lost world? So for this reason, Jesus pointed out that many people, in regard to sacrifice in the context of marriage, their hearts were hardened. And they need to learn the new way. That is the true meaning of marriage. Apostle Paul, who obviously had great insight into all the topics of life. He wrote in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 24 to 27, "Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives." Now look at this. "Just as Christ loved the church," and let's read this next part together. So, "Just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." And gave himself up for her. You know, I thought as I was preparing this message that marriage should be a husband should sacrifice for wives, wives should sacrifice for husbands, and then everything's beautiful. I only see one party that's asked to give themselves up for the other. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church, which we know is completely sacrificially, and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. I think Missionary Paul Lim mentioned, look how long the part is for husbands here. Look how short the part is for wives. So I think that primarily when you look at what gender is being talked about in this passage of Mark's gospel, it's men. It's men that were the ones that were writing certificates of divorce. It was men who at the end, the disciples asked Jesus again about this. We'll get to that part. But it's men that predominantly have abused the authority of being a leader in the household and have made the institution of marriage a means for selfish gain, and as a result has caused great grief and misery upon women. For example, it's just so crazy. Some of the still archaic ways. This is in parts of the Muslim world, women are expected to walk at least 3 steps behind their husband. They're required, obviously, to wear a lot of covering, and even in a lot of places they can't even drive cars. It's terrible oppression of men who are not sacrificing for their wives, but instead are using the institution of marriage for their own selfish gain. It's truly phenomenally wicked. Now, of course, the pendulum swings the other way, and now we see a gigantic movement against the so-called patriarchy, because there's been a long history of marriage being abused by men. So now we have gigantic movements of feminism popping up, which are protesting this. But the problem isn't feminism. The problem isn't crazy oppression. The problem is that people don't know God's mind about marriage. So let's look at what God has in mind. Let's look at part 2, one flesh, Mark chapter 6, verses 10 verses 6 to 9. Let's read 6 to 9 together. Okay, let's go. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." In God's mind, God's mind about marriage was revealed from the very first marriage. When Adam and Eve were brought together by God, and then Adam made his confession of love towards his wife, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then the commentary from Genesis is found in verse 7. "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife." I think in a lot of ways this verse shows that oneness is God's intention. Complete oneness between a man and a woman. They're two people, but they become so integrated, so unified, so close that you can think of them as one flesh. So that, as he says here, so they are no longer two, but one. So what is the real problem about marriage these days? Why do we see such weird things like in the Islamic world? Why do we see such crazy divorce rates in the Western world? I think it can be boiled down that people are still remaining as two instead of becoming one. Marriage can't remain as two separate people. But this is what happens. So here's a little nice photo of two lovebirds falling in love. Boy meets girl. They meet, they look in each other's eyes and they think, wow, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. How many billions of dollars have been made and have been invested to tell this story of two people falling in love? But have you noticed that all those stories somehow always end when the two get married, or the princess, and they win the victory, and then they have the wedding? It always ends there. It doesn't show the lifelong process of marriage. It just shows the coming together. And when we look around us, we see that, this becomes this. And then later, lawyers get brought in, and then it becomes this. Why? Why is it the case that a marriage starts off like a beautiful home, but in the end it's burned down? People burn down their marriages. They trash their marriages. They break the windows, kick down the doors, light it on fire, and just trash their marriage. It started off so beautiful, so romantic. The nice, even writing beautiful songs to each other. My wife and I wrote her so many beautiful emails when we were engaged. And I think something happened to her Yahoo account, and they're all lost now. But that's okay, because I can say that our marriage is stronger today than the day we got married, because of Jesus. But this isn't the case for so many people, because they end up trashing their marriage. And why is it really the case? It's because they do not make one. They do not make one flesh. Sacrifices makes one, not ones. Little typo there. Sacrifice makes one. When men, especially as the leaders of the family, love and sacrifice for their wives and do not use marriage for their own selfish purposes and brings God into the household, then one can happen. This passage, primarily, I'm not going to talk about women, because this passage really kind of focuses on man's job. So let's look a little bit more at it and see how the disciples reacted to this as men. Let's look at Mark chapter 10, verses 10 through 12. Let's read these together. Let's go. When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. The disciples had heard Jesus teaching, and when they got into the house again, I think that they were like, gosh, is this really the case? Boy, this is tough. This is tough teaching. So they asked him, did you really mean what you're saying? Or can you clarify? Because the way you're saying it, sounds like divorce is not an option anymore. You know, just think about that for a second. Men, if we have divorce as some kind of option, it's a really terrible situation. And I think that a lot of the men of Jesus' time, a lot of men of our time, they keep divorce in their back pocket. That if they ever stop getting what they want out of the marriage, they can pull out the divorce card and play the divorce card. And it's really terrible. I think the disciples were surprised that Jesus was taking away the divorce card from men. And he did. He answered very clearly in verse 11, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. Divorce is not an option. It should not be considered as a backup plan when things get going, when things get tough. As husbands, we're called to love our wives sacrificially and to create one with them. We're to leave our mother and father's household and become one with our wives. And this was probably a new way of looking at life for the disciples. So in conclusion, we learn that today's passage about divorce is nested in between a lot of other passages about losing yourself, sacrificing for other people, denying yourself, becoming least in order to become the greatest. And as men and husbands, this passage is very pertinent because for a long time, marriage has been a bastion of selfishness. But divorce is being mentioned in a bunch of passages about selflessness. And as Christians, we are to promote the self-sacrifice that Jesus has shown as an example for us to lay down our lives and to sacrifice for our lives. May God help us to do so. Let's read the key verse together. Okay, let's go. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. One word, let no one separate. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for blessing us with this time, and we can come to the Word of God and relearn about marriage. Help us to really take to heart the true intention of marriage to become one. And may us as husbands sacrifice to really become the least so that we can be good leaders for our households. We thank you and pray in